Say the word circumstantial evidence. Don't be afraid of the terminology. Judge Coward is going to instruct you on the law concerning circumstantial evidence. He's going to tell you that it's legal evidence, it's good evidence, and it's sufficient to prove a crime with circumstantial evidence. Listen very carefully to him as he tells you that, because there's no aura surrounding the term of circumstantial evidence. It's good evidence. In this particular case, what kinds of circumstantial evidence do we have? Well, let's see. We have a man that has been positively identified as living in Tallahassee back during January of 1978. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that there's anything illegal about living in Tallahassee. God knows I do. But that is a circumstance in this case that you have got to take into consideration, because not everybody in the whole United States or in the world was living there. It is a circumstance that is consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. What's another circumstance that we have in this case? We produced for you the witnesses who signed the lease with the defendant in this case back on January the 7th of 1978, 1 week prior to the crimes that occurred here. The witness was Larry Wingfield, and we brought to court the lease that was signed on that day. Ladies and gentlemen, each of you had a chance to look at this as it was being passed around. January the 7th of 1978, the defendant in this case signed this lease in Tallahassee at a rooming house called the Oaks with the name of Chris M. Hagan. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a circumstance that you have got to take into consideration. Why did he sign the name of Chris Hagan to this lease? Why was he in Tallahassee trying to hide his identity? That is a circumstance that is consistent with guilt, and it is inconsistent with innocence. What about some of the other circumstances that were involved in this case? Do you recall the testimony of the young girls who were in Sherrod's on the night of the murder? Connie Hastings, Mary Ann Picano, Carla Black, all of those girls there in Sherrod's. Carla Black didn't even know the other two. Sherrod's was a small disco nightclub located next door to the Chi Omega sorority house. Connie Hastings took the witness stand and told you that on the night of these murders, approximately 10 o'clock, 10:30 p.m., somewhere in that neighborhood, she saw this man standing over on one side of the dance floor, and that he was staring. If I remember right, she put her hands like this, and she said he was just scanning the whole area. Mary Ann Picano, her friend, also saw the man. Scared her so bad she can't even remember what he looks like. He came up to her and asked her to dance. What was the words that Mary Ann Picano used to her friends whenever she went to dance with that man? She said, "I think I'm about to dance with an ex-con." Ladies and gentlemen, there was a reason for that statement being made. And the reason ties directly into the testimony of Carla Black, who was the other girl that was in Sherrod's that night. She testified that she saw this man standing there also. She described what he looked like, and she said that he was staring at her. It was an intense and unnerving stare, is her exact words. She was asked by the defense, "Have you ever had a man stare at you in a bar before?" And what did she say? She said, "Not like that. It was a stare that made me very uncomfortable, as if that was what it was meant to do." Ladies and gentlemen, that is a circumstance that you have got to take into consideration in this case. This man was next door to the Kyle Davis sorority house on the morning of the murders. And there was something wrong with it. That's all there is to it. Because he was staring at those girls as if to make them feel uncomfortable. A circumstance that is consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. What were some of the other circumstances that were involved in this case that we need to talk about? What about Henry Palumbo and Rusty Gage? You remember the two of those guys, the ones with the long hair, the first one with the red hair, and the other one with the kind of blonde, dirty blonde hair. Those guys were out like they were on most Saturday nights, having a good time. And they came back to the Oaks, the rooming house where this defendant lived. The testimony of each of them was that they got back to the Oaks that morning about 4:45 a.m. Remember the testimony as it flowed through this entire case. We had the murders that occurred at the Kyle Mega House somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 o'clock a.m. Excuse me, the police actually called at 3:19 a.m., which had to be just a few minutes after Nita saw this man go through the door. Shortly thereafter, about 4 o'clock a.m., we had a burglary and an attempted murder that occurred at Dunwoody Street. According to the testimony of Officer Wilton Dozier, it's only about 2/10 of a mile from the Kyle Mega sorority house to the Dunwoody Street residence. So we've got about 45 minutes in there that it took this man to go from the Kyle Mega sorority house to Dunwoody and actually get in there and begin to do the damage that he did to Cheryl Thomas on that morning. The two girls that lived next door to Cheryl Thomas called the police. The police received that call, according to Officer Dozier, at 4:37 a.m. Isn't it strange, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't it strange that within minutes after that call came in to the police, the defendant in this case, Theodore Robert Bundy, or Chris, as Henry Palumbo and Rusty Gage knew, was seen standing on the front door, at the front door of the Oaks apartment. What was he doing? According to both of them, he was standing there with his head kind of down, looking in the direction of the cameras. I wonder why. I wonder why. We're talking about minutes after these assaults and murders took place. They said, "Hello, how you doing?" No response. The testimony was that he was always talking to them. He would always acknowledge them. Not that morning, ladies and gentlemen. Not that morning. And I wonder why. That is a circumstance that is consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. The morning of the murders, standing there, fully dressed. Minutes, just minutes after this thing happened. What else about Henry Palumbo and Russell Gage's testimony was important? Remember the conversation that they testified to that occurred on the morning of the murders, later that morning there at the Oaks, while everybody was sitting around discussing this thing? The defendant came in while they were discussing. The testimony of Henry Palumbo and Rusty Gage was totally consistent. They told you that the defendant in this case said to them that he thought this was a professional job. A professional job done by somebody who had done it before and who was probably long gone. Ladies and gentlemen, this man recognized of these murders that this was a professional job, that no clues had been left. He thought he got away scot-free. What else came out through the testimony of Russell Gage? Russell Gage told you about the day whenever he was sitting around or standing around talking with Chris, and Chris was bragging to him about how smart he was, about how he knew his way around the law. And what did he tell him? You know, sometimes the most important pieces of evidence come into court with the least amount of fanfare. And there was no fanfare surrounding this statement. I don't know if you even picked it up as we went through the testimony or not. He told you that he was smart enough that he could get away with any crime. He was smart enough to get away with any crime. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a circumstance that is consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. Now, let's talk about something else that happened in this case. Whenever it happened, I'm sure that you didn't have any forewarning of what was happening, and perhaps you didn't pick up all the significance of the testimony as it came down. You remember the testimony of a young boy that had a van that lived on St. Augustine Street that 2 days prior to the murders occurring in this case, he realized that his tag was missing. Call that testimony. That was the testimony of Randy Reagans. He told you about his tag being 13D11300 was his tag number. And he got up on the morning of January the 13th, the tag was gone. Didn't know what happened to it. Nothing very significant about that, I'm sure, as you listen to the testimony. But you've got to take that testimony and tie it into the later testimony that took place. The testimony of Deputy Keith Dawes. Deputy Dawes saw this man during the early morning hours of February the 11th of 1978. This is 3 weeks after the murders, and the defendant's still in Tallahassee. 3 weeks after the murders. February 11th, early morning hours, about 1:47 a.m., if I remember his testimony right. Officer Dawes was on a special detail, special kind of thing that they were doing at that time, checking people out. He was riding down the street in his car. It's an unmarked police car, but he had his uniform on. He came along and he saw the defendant in this case, standing next to a car parked along the side of the street. He pulled up there and stopped, said, "What you doing?" Said, "Well, I'm looking for a book." Started investigating, looking around, and he saw a tag in the floorboard of that car. When he got that tag out, which just happened to be 13D11300, and went back to his patrol car, what happened? What happened? The defendant in this case ran. Deputy Dawes couldn't catch him. And where did he lose him at? Right in the backyard of the Oaks. He ran directly back to the Oaks, where Deputy Dawes couldn't find him. Why did he run? Why did he run? He didn't run whenever Deputy Dawes first walked up there. He saw Deputy Dawes in his uniform. He didn't run then. When did he run? He ran when Deputy Dawes found that tag. That tag put him in the area of the Dunwoody Street crimes, not more than 100 feet from where it occurred 2 days prior to the murders. Couple that with the testimony of Officer Roy Dickey, the Tallahassee Police Department officer that was on duty the same night as Officer Dawes. And he saw this defendant walking down St. Augustine Street and cut in behind the houses, right there in the same area where the Dunwoody Street assault took place. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a circumstance. Those are circumstances that are consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. What other testimony took place that was of significance concerning that same little episode? You remember the testimony of Officer David Lee? Officer David Lee worked for the Pensacola Police Department. Officer Lee was on duty during the early morning hours of February the 15th. We're talking about 3 to 4 days now after Deputy Dawes had caught this man, or tried to catch him, there in Tallahassee. Officer Lee told you that he stopped this man driving a Volkswagen there in Pensacola, that he had everything he owned in that car. Couple that with the testimony of Deputy Bill Gunner, the crime scene investigator that went back to the Oaks, to room number 12 where this defendant lived. It was perfectly clean. He had loaded up and packed up everything he had, and he was getting out of Dodge. That's what it amounts to. The heat was on, and he was going. He was caught by Officer Lee in Pensacola. What happened when Officer Lee caught him? The first thing that happened is they got involved in a resisting kind of situation. He had the man down on the ground. He was trying to handcuff him whenever all of a sudden he turned over, jerked his feet out from under him, and they ended up tussling. Shots were fired. What did this defendant do as soon as he could get loose from Officer Lee? Ladies and gentlemen, he ran. He ran. Why did he run in Tallahassee? Why did he load up all of his stuff, get in the car, be heading west, going to Pensacola, on farther? Why did he run from Officer Lee? Once Officer Lee got him in custody and put him in that patrol car, do you recall Officer Lee's testimony? Here again, a lot of times some of the most significant things in the trial, just, they come in with no fanfare. You maybe don't even pick them up, but I'm sure some of them do. Officer Lee said on the way to the station that the defendant in this case, Theodore Bundy, said to him, "I wish you had killed me. If I run now, will you shoot me?" Ladies and gentlemen, why did he say those things to Officer Lee? Here is a man that has committed the most horrible and brutal murder known to the Tallahassee area. That's why. He can't live with himself anymore. And he wanted Officer Lee to kill him right then and right there. Those are circumstances that you have got to take into consideration in this case that are consistent with guilt and inconsistent with innocence. Ladies and gentlemen, as I indicated to you, this case is built on 3 different kinds of evidence. The eyewitness testimony, positive identification, circumstantial evidence, scientific evidence. At this point, all we've talked about is the positive eyewitness testimony and the circumstantial evidence. We could stop right now, and this case would have been proven to. The evidence would have been sufficient for a conviction in this case. But ladies and gentlemen, we didn't stop there. We took this case the extra mile to prove it to you, to show it to you, so that you could see it. We brought in here, into this courtroom, the testimony of Patricia Lasco to testify about the hair examinations that were done in this case. She testified that she took a pantyhose mask that was found at Dunwoody Street, and she carefully pulled from it 2 Caucasian head hairs and 1 animal hair. None others. That's all that was there. Now the defense during the course of this trial tried to make a big deal out of the fact that the pantyhose mask was put on the floor and there were other people in the rooms and things like that. Folks, if that pantyhose mask was contaminated, that you'd have something else other than 2 hairs and a cat hair that happened to be exactly alike. No, the man that was wearing that pantyhose mask that night was wearing it for a reason. He was doing this job in a professional manner. He was hiding his identification while he did it. And that pantyhose mask came directly from the man that committed these crimes. The hairs from that pantyhose mask also came from that man. The testimony of Patricia Laska was that she took those hairs, the 2 that came from the Dunwoody Street pantyhose mask, and compared them to the hairs of this defendant. What was her conclusion? She told you that the hairs were similar to Theodore Bundy's and that they could have come from him. What else did she say about it, though? And I wrote this down whenever she said it. I thought it was going to be important later on. She said that either those hairs came from Theodore Bundy or from somebody else who had hair exactly like his. Ladies and gentlemen, how many people in this world could have hair exactly like Theodore Bundy's? Huh? I can look at you people on the jury. We didn't stop there, though, either, ladies and gentlemen. We brought to you a new form of evidence. It took extraordinary means to bring this case to you, to bring the proof to court. The bite mark evidence in this case was extremely important. It related back to Dr. Wood's autopsy of Lisa Lee. Dr. Wood recognized right there at the autopsy that this was a significant piece of evidence, that he, in fact, recognized that what we had involved in this case was a double bite mark, and that it could be important for the later investigation and prosecution of this case, and it was. We brought to you the testimony of Dr. Richard Soubron, the testimony of Dr. Homer Campbell, and the testimony of Dr. Lowell Levine about those bite marks that were found on the buttocks of Lisa Lee. Dr. Wood had already told you that in his opinion, the bite mark was made at or near the cause of death. That's a lot different, ladies and gentlemen, than a fingerprint. We don't know when fingerprints are left, but by George, we know when a bite mark is left. That pathologist, Dr. Wood, testified the bite mark was left at or about the time of death. Dr. Soubron testified, and he showed you, he demonstrated for you what the analysis was that he made in this case. He took models of this defendant's teeth and compared them to that bite mark. What was his conclusion? With a reasonable degree of dental certainty, Theodore Robert Bundy made that bite mark in the buttocks of Lisa Lee. That was his conclusion. But here again, sometimes the most significant things, perhaps, are the things that come about with very little fanfare. How did he describe it? When asked on cross-examination about the possibility of somebody else in this world having teeth that could have left those marks, what did he say? He said it was like finding a needle in a haystack. A needle in a haystack. How impossible is that? What about the testimony of Dr. Homer Campbell, who testified concerning the photo enhancement that was done of this bite mark photograph? You recall his testimony about how he placed the photograph into the machine and how it came back with what was a topographical map in order to show you the various peaks and valleys that were actually involved in this bite mark. Then we placed on the stand Dr. Lowell Levine, the chief consultant for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office in dental matters. He testified to you that in his opinion, the bite marks in this case, within a reasonable degree of dental certainty, were left by the defendant in this case, Theodore Robert Bundy. Here again, sometimes the most important things and the most significant things are the ones that have no fanfare attached to them. When asked about the possibility of someone else leaving this bite mark, or of someone else even having teeth that could have left this bite mark, he told you that it was a practical impossibility. A practical impossibility. Ladies and gentlemen, you've had the benefit of all the testimony in this case. The eyewitness testimony alone is sufficient for conviction in this case. You couple the eyewitness testimony with the circumstantial evidence that was presented, and then you bring in the scientific evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, based on all of that evidence is what you've got to render your verdict on, not just one little piece of it. The defense in this case put on the witness stand their own dentist in a desperate, last-minute attack to try to put some kind of a dent in that dental evidence that was presented. But they just couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. On cross-examination, Dr. DeVore, the defense expert, had to tell you, and he did, that the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, could have left that bite mark. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense was in a real problem situation. Anytime they've got to put a witness on that tells you that their man could have committed this crime, they've got a real problem. And it was a desperate move. It was a gamble that might have succeeded, but it didn't. That's why I say that you have got to consider all of the evidence that's presented in this case. And there's only one conclusion that you can reach. Only one conclusion that you can reach. Based on the oath that each of you took as jurors in this case, to base your verdict on the evidence, to follow the law that the judge instructs you on. Ladies and gentlemen, it is your duty to return a verdict of guilty as charged in this case. Good? Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the allocation of time for closing arguments, the court has allowed both sides an hour and a half. The defense's argument will be continuous. For that reason, we'll take about a 10-minute recess at this time, complete theirs, and then we'll complete the state's. We'll take them out for a
Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, please retire to the jury room.
Court will be in recess 10 minutes.
Please remain seated till the judge is out of the courtroom. Court will be in recess for 10 minutes. Either remain seated or step outside now that being no milling around in the courtroom. You either go outside or stay seated. Please remain seated or go out in the hall. Don't be milling around. Ma'am, please be seated.
one at a time.
Why?
That's part of the.